Hannah's world shattered in 10 seconds. The words, "You're fired," echoed through the restaurant as her manager's face twisted with disgust. Speaking Japanese to a lonely customer had cost her everything, or so she thought. What neither she nor Paul realized was that the quiet gentleman in the corner booth held the power to destroy or elevate their entire company with a single phone call. In this shocking tale of cultural prejudice and hidden power, witness how one act of kindness becomes the catalyst for a $3 billion revelation that will leave everyone speechless. Subscribe to discover how this waitress's firing becomes the manager's worst nightmare. The afternoon sun filtered through the restaurant's windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors as Hannah wiped down table after table with mechanical precision. Her movements carried the weight of someone who had learned to find dignity in service, each gesture deliberate and careful, despite the exhaustion that had settled into her bones after another double shift. The lunch rush had finally subsided, leaving behind the familiar symphony of clinking dishes and muted conversations that had become the soundtrack to her days. She paused for a moment, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear as she surveyed the dining room, her eyes naturally drawn to the solitary figure seated in the corner booth. The elderly Japanese gentleman sat with perfect posture, his hands folded neatly on the table as he studied the menu with an expression that seemed both thoughtful and slightly lost. Something about his demeanor tugged at Hannah's heart. Perhaps it was the way he held himself with quiet dignity, or the subtle confusion that flickered across his features as he examined the English descriptions of dishes that clearly held no familiar meaning for him. Hannah had always possessed an unusual gift for languages, a talent that had bloomed during her college years when she had immersed herself in Japanese culture and literature. The language had spoken to her soul in ways that English never could, its nuanced expressions and respectful formalities offering a window into a world where courtesy and consideration were elevated to art forms. She had spent countless hours perfecting her pronunciation, studying not just the words, but the cultural context that gave them meaning, understanding that true communication went far beyond mere translation. Her professors had praised her natural ability to capture the subtle emotional undertones that made Japanese such a beautifully complex language. And even now, years after graduation, she continued to practice through online conversations and cultural exchange programs. The skill had never seemed particularly valuable in her current role as a waitress, but as she watched the gentleman struggle with the menu, she felt that familiar pull of connection that transcended cultural boundaries. The restaurant buzzed with its usual afternoon energy, but Hannah found herself increasingly aware of the man's quiet struggle as he attempted to decipher the menu's offerings. She noticed how his fingers traced the words with careful deliberation, how his brow furrowed slightly when he encountered particularly complex descriptions, and how he occasionally glanced around the room as if hoping for some form of assistance that never came. Other servers passed by his table without a second glance, their attention focused on more demanding customers or the endless tasks that filled their shifts. But Hannah felt drawn to his corner booth like a moth to flame. There was something about his presence that commanded respect, not through arrogance or demands, but through the quiet dignity with which he carried himself, the way he nodded politely to passing staff even when they ignored him completely. His expensive suit was understated yet impeccably tailored, his silver hair perfectly groomed, and his hands bore the soft calluses of someone who had worked with both mind and body throughout his life. As Hannah approached his table, she felt her heart rate quicken with a mixture of nervousness and excitement that always accompanied her opportunities to use her Japanese skills in real-world situations. The gentleman looked up as she drew near, his dark eyes reflecting a warmth that immediately put her at ease, despite the language barrier that stood between them. She could see the slight tension in his shoulders, the way he held the menu just a fraction too tightly, and the almost imperceptible relief that crossed his features when she offered him a genuine smile instead of the hurried politeness that most servers provided. "Konnichiwa," she said softly, her voice carrying the respectful tone that Japanese conversation demanded, and she watched as his entire demeanor transformed in an instant. His eyes widened with surprise and genuine delight, his posture straightened with renewed confidence, and a smile spread across his features that seemed to illuminate the entire corner of the restaurant where he sat. The conversation that followed flowed with an ease that surprised them both, as Hannah's carefully cultivated language skills met his obvious relief at being able to communicate in his native tongue. She asked about his preferences with the formal politeness that Japanese culture demanded, explaining the menu items in detail and offering suggestions based on his dietary needs and taste preferences. He spoke of his love for traditional flavors, but his willingness to try new interpretations, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to being heard and respected in business settings. Hannah found herself genuinely engaged in their conversation, asking about his travels and sharing her own passion for Japanese culture, their exchange becoming less about taking an order and more about two people connecting across cultural boundaries. The gentleman's responses revealed glimpses of a sophisticated worldview, references to international business dealings, and a deep appreciation for the cultural bridge that Hannah was building through her linguistic abilities. What neither of them noticed was Paul's growing irritation as he watched the extended conversation from across the restaurant, his face darkening with each passing minute as he observed what he perceived as time-wasting behavior. The manager's jaw tightened as he saw Hannah laughing at something the customer had said, her genuine enjoyment of the conversation evident in her relaxed posture and animated gestures. To Paul's narrow perspective, this was nothing more than an employee shirking her duties, indulging in unnecessary chatter when she should have been turning tables and maximizing revenue. He had no understanding of the cultural significance of what was transpiring, no appreciation for the respect and dignity that Hannah was showing to a customer who had clearly felt overlooked and undervalued by the restaurant's typical service approach. As the conversation continued, Paul's anger built like pressure in a kettle, his limited worldview unable to comprehend that sometimes the most valuable service came not from speed and efficiency, but from genuine human connection and cultural understanding. Subscribe to witness how this beautiful moment of cultural exchange becomes the spark that ignites a corporate earthquake. Paul's footsteps echoed across the restaurant floor with the sharp precision of someone whose authority had been challenged, each step carrying the weight of his mounting frustration as he approached the corner booth where Hannah continued her animated conversation with the Japanese gentleman. His face had taken on the mottled red complexion that his employees had learned to recognize as a warning sign, the telltale flush that preceded his most explosive outbursts and unreasonable demands. The manager's narrow worldview had been shaped by years of viewing customer service through the lens of pure efficiency, where every moment not directly contributing to table turnover represented lost revenue and wasted resources. He had built his reputation on running a tight ship, on maintaining the kind of rigid control that impressed corporate executives during their quarterly visits, and Hannah's extended conversation represented everything he despised about employees who thought they could deviate from established protocols. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he watched her laugh at something the customer had said, her genuine enjoyment of the cultural exchange reading to him as nothing more than insubordination and time theft. The restaurant's atmosphere seemed to shift as Paul's presence approached the table, other staff members instinctively sensing the storm that was building and finding reasons to busy themselves in distant corners of the dining room. Hannah remained blissfully unaware of the approaching tempest. her attention fully focused on explaining the subtle differences between various preparation methods to Mr. Kenji, who listened with the kind of respectful attention that suggested both genuine interest and deep appreciation for her cultural knowledge. The conversation had evolved beyond mere menu discussion into a meaningful exchange about culinary traditions, travel experiences, and the challenges of navigating unfamiliar cultural landscapes in foreign countries. Mr. Kenji's responses revealed layers of sophistication and worldliness that spoke to extensive international experience. His references to business dealings in multiple countries and his nuanced understanding of cross-cultural communication, painting the picture of someone far more significant than his quiet demeanor might suggest. Hannah found herself energized by the intellectual stimulation of their exchange, her passion for Japanese culture finally finding an outlet in her otherwise routine workday. Paul's approach carried all the subtlety of a charging bull, his heavy breathing and aggressive posture telegraphing his intentions long before he reached the table, where Hannah and Mr. Kenji continued their respectful dialogue. The manager's limited perspective had transformed what was clearly a positive customer experience into a personal affront to his authority, his inability to understand Japanese making him suspicious of conversations he couldn't monitor and control. Years of managing through intimidation and rigid adherence to corporate policies had stripped away any appreciation he might have once possessed for the human elements that made dining experiences memorable and meaningful. His worldview recognized only metrics and efficiency ratings, customer satisfaction scores that could be quantified and reported to higher management, leaving no room for the intangible benefits of cultural connection and genuine hospitality. The irony was lost on him that his restaurant's corporate mission statement prominently featured words like inclusive, welcoming, and culturally diverse, values that existed only on paper while being systematically undermined by his narrow interpretation of proper service standards. Hannah's first indication of trouble came when she noticed Mr. Kenji's expression shift subtly, his eyes moving past her shoulder with a slight tightening around the corners that suggested incoming unpleasantness. She turned to find Paul standing directly behind her, his face flushed with anger and his posture radiating the kind of aggressive energy that made other customers glance nervously in their direction. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Paul's voice cut through the restaurant's ambient noise like a blade, his tone carrying enough venom to make nearby diners pause their conversations and turn their attention toward the unfolding confrontation. Hannah felt her stomach drop as she realized that her moment of cultural connection was about to be transformed into a public humiliation. Her genuine attempt to provide exceptional customer service being reframed as some kind of workplace violation. The contrast between the respectful, dignified conversation she had been enjoying with Mr. Kenji and the crude aggression now emanating from her manager created a jarring dissonance that seemed to pollute the very air around their table. The accusation that followed hit Hannah like a physical blow, Paul's words designed not just to correct what he perceived as inappropriate behavior, but to humiliate and diminish her in front of both the customer and the other staff members who had begun to gather at a safe distance. "You're here to take orders and serve food, not to waste time chatting in whatever language that was," he snarled, his voice dripping with the kind of cultural ignorance that transformed linguistic diversity into something suspicious and unwelcome. Hannah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger as she realized that her manager's worldview was so narrow that he couldn't distinguish between time-wasting conversation and genuine customer service, his prejudices making him incapable of recognizing the value of cultural accommodation and respect. Mr. Kenji's expression had shifted from pleasant engagement to something much more serious, his dark eyes now studying Paul with the kind of intense focus that suggested he was cataloging every word and gesture for future reference. The elderly gentleman's posture remained perfectly composed, but Hannah noticed a subtle change in his bearing, a quiet authority that seemed to fill the space around him despite his continued silence. Paul's tirade continued with increasing volume and viciousness, his words chosen specifically to maximize Hannah's humiliation while demonstrating his authority to anyone within earshot of the confrontation. "This is a restaurant, not some cultural center where you can practice your foreign languages on customers who probably just want to eat their meal in peace," he declared, his ignorance of the situation so complete that he failed to notice Mr. Kenji's increasingly sharp attention to every word being spoken. Hannah felt tears of frustration and anger building behind her eyes as she realized that her genuine attempt to provide exceptional service was being twisted into evidence of unprofessional behavior, her cultural sensitivity being weaponized against her by a manager whose narrow worldview couldn't accommodate anything beyond his limited understanding of proper customer interaction. The restaurant had fallen almost completely silent now, other diners openly staring at the confrontation, while staff members exchanged worried glances and tried to determine whether they should intervene or simply hope that Paul's anger would burn itself out before causing permanent damage to the establishment's reputation. Subscribe to see how Paul's ignorant rage is about to collide with a force that will reshape his entire world. The words that would change everything hung in the air like a death sentence, Paul's voice rising to a volume that ensured every person in the restaurant would witness Hannah's professional execution. "You're fired," he declared, with the kind of finality that brooked no argument, his satisfaction at wielding absolute power evident in the cruel smile that played at the corners of his mouth as he watched the color drain from Hannah's face. The announcement hit her like a physical blow, her carefully constructed life suddenly crumbling around her, as the reality of unemployment crashed down upon her with devastating force. She thought of her rent payment due next week, the student loans that consumed a significant portion of her income, the careful budget that allowed her to survive on a waitress's wages while she pursued her dreams of eventually using her language skills in a more meaningful career. Paul's decision wasn't just taking away her job, it was destroying the delicate financial ecosystem that kept her afloat in an increasingly expensive city where opportunities for someone with her qualifications remained frustratingly limited. Hannah's hands trembled as she untied her apron with mechanical movements, her mind struggling to process the sudden shift from meaningful cultural exchange to career-ending humiliation in the span of mere minutes. The other staff members watched in stunned silence, their faces reflecting a mixture of sympathy for Hannah and fear for their own job security as they witnessed how quickly Paul's anger could transform their workplace into a battlefield. She had always been well liked among her colleagues, known for her willingness to cover difficult shifts and her genuine kindness toward both customers and co-workers, making her sudden dismissal feel like an attack on the entire team's sense of security and fairness. The restaurant's atmosphere had become thick with tension, other diners shifting uncomfortably in their seats as they found themselves unwilling witnesses to what felt more like a public execution than a workplace disciplinary action. Hannah's eyes filled with tears that she refused to let fall, her pride demanding that she maintain some dignity even as her world collapsed around her with devastating completeness. Mr. Kenji remained seated throughout the confrontation, his expression unreadable, but his attention focused with laser-like intensity on every word and gesture that Paul made during his power display. The elderly gentleman's hands remained folded on the table, his posture maintaining the same respectful composure that had characterized their earlier conversation. But something had shifted in his bearing that suggested depths of authority and influence that neither Hannah nor Paul could have imagined. His dark eyes tracked Paul's movements with the kind of analytical precision that spoke to decades of experience in evaluating character and competence, his silence carrying more weight than any words could have conveyed in that moment of crisis. Hannah caught his eye briefly as she gathered her personal belongings, seeing something in his expression that might have been sympathy, or perhaps something far more significant that she was too distraught to properly interpret. The connection they had shared through their cultural exchange now felt like a distant memory, overwhelmed by the immediate crisis of her sudden unemployment and the public humiliation that Paul had orchestrated with such obvious satisfaction. Paul's victory lap continued as he addressed the restaurant's other customers with the kind of false concern that barely masked his satisfaction at having demonstrated his authority so decisively. "I apologize for the disruption, folks," he announced with theatrical sincerity, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure that his words reached every corner of the dining room. "We maintain the highest standards of professional service here, and sometimes that requires making difficult decisions to ensure our customers receive the attention they deserve." Oh, the irony of his statement was lost on him completely, his narrow worldview preventing him from recognizing that he had just fired the one employee who had been providing exactly the kind of exceptional, culturally sensitive service that modern businesses claim to value. His speech was designed to position himself as the hero of the situation, the decisive manager who had identified and eliminated a problem before it could affect other customers' experiences, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just created a far more significant problem than any he had solved. Hannah's final moments as an employee of the restaurant played out with excruciating slowness, each step toward the exit feeling like a walk of shame that would haunt her for years to come. She could feel the eyes of every customer and staff member following her progress, their mixture of sympathy and morbid curiosity creating a gauntlet of humiliation that Paul had clearly designed to maximize her suffering and reinforce his authority over the remaining employees. The weight of her sudden unemployment pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden, the practical implications of her firing beginning to cascade through her mind as she realized how quickly her carefully maintained financial stability would crumble without her steady income. Her dreams of eventually parlaying her language skills into a more meaningful career now seemed impossibly distant, overshadowed by the immediate necessity of finding another service job that would allow her to survive while she rebuilt her professional reputation from the ashes of this public humiliation. As Hannah reached the restaurant's entrance, she turned back for one final look at the scene of her professional destruction, her eyes automatically seeking out Mr. Kenji's table, where the elderly gentleman continued to sit in contemplative silence. Something in his expression had changed during Paul's performance, a subtle shift that transformed his earlier warmth into something much more serious and calculating, his dark eyes now holding depths of authority and power that seemed completely at odds with his quiet, unassuming presence. Paul stood near the center of the dining room, like a conquering general surveying his battlefield, his chest puffed with pride at having handled what he perceived as a difficult personnel situation with decisive authority, completely unaware that his actions had just set in motion a chain of events that would soon transform his moment of triumph into the worst mistake of his professional career. The restaurant's atmosphere remained charged with tension as Hannah pushed through the exit doors, leaving behind not just her job, but also a situation that was about to explode in ways that neither she nor Paul could have possibly anticipated. Subscribe to discover how Paul's moment of victory becomes the catalyst for his complete professional destruction. Mr. Kenji remained motionless in his corner booth long after Hannah's departure, his composed exterior masking the storm of thoughts and emotions that Paul's display of ignorance and cruelty had unleashed within his analytical mind. The elderly gentleman's fingers drummed silently against the table's surface as he processed what he had just witnessed, his decades of experience in international business having taught him to recognize character flaws and leadership failures with devastating accuracy. The cultural insensitivity that Paul had displayed wasn't just personally offensive to someone who had spent his entire career navigating cross-cultural business relationships. It represented exactly the kind of narrow-minded thinking that could destroy companies and partnerships worth billions of dollars in today's interconnected global economy. His dark eyes continued to track Paul's movements around the restaurant, cataloging every gesture and expression as the manager basked in what he clearly believed was a decisive demonstration of his leadership capabilities, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just revealed himself to be exactly the kind of liability that sophisticated investors worked tirelessly to identify and eliminate. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Mr. Genji as he reflected on the morning's board meeting, where he had been presented with detailed proposals for a $3 billion investment that would transform this restaurant chain from a regional operation into a global powerhouse. The presentation had been impressive, filled with market analysis and growth projections that painted a picture of unlimited potential in international markets, particularly in Asia, where cultural sensitivity and respect for local customs would be absolutely critical to success. The executives had spoken eloquently about their commitment to diversity and inclusion, their understanding of global markets, and their ability to adapt their brand to different cultural contexts while maintaining the core values that had made them successful in their domestic market. Now, as he watched Paul continue his victory lap around the dining room, Mr. Genji realized that the gap between corporate rhetoric and ground-level reality was far wider than anyone in that boardroom had imagined, and that gap represented a risk factor that could destroy any international expansion before it even began. Paul's continued performance provided Mr. Genji with additional data points that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of the company's actual culture and values beneath its polished corporate facade. The manager's obvious satisfaction at having humiliated an employee in front of customers demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of modern hospitality principles, while his dismissive attitude toward linguistic diversity revealed exactly the kind of cultural blindness that would make international expansion not just difficult, but potentially catastrophic. Mr. Genji had witnessed similar scenarios play out across multiple industries and continents, watching promising companies destroy themselves through cultural insensitivity and poor leadership decisions that alienated customers and partners in key markets. The $3 billion investment he had been considering wasn't just about financial returns. It was about building bridges between cultures and creating opportunities for meaningful cross-cultural exchange, goals that seemed impossible to achieve with managers like Paul representing the company's values at the operational level. The weight of Mr. Genji's true identity and the power he wielded in the corporate world created a stark contrast with his quiet presence in the corner booth, his unassuming demeanor masking influence that extended across multiple continents and industries. As the principal investor behind some of the most successful international business ventures of the past decade, he had learned to evaluate potential partners not just through financial statements and market projections, but through their demonstrated commitment to the values that made global success possible: cultural sensitivity, respect for diversity, and the ability to recognize and nurture talent regardless of its packaging were non-negotiable requirements for any company that hoped to succeed in today's interconnected marketplace. Paul's treatment of Hannah had revealed deficiencies in all of these critical areas, transforming what should have been a routine due diligence visit into a devastating indictment of the company's readiness for international expansion. Mr. Genji's phone buzzed softly against the table, displaying messages from his investment team who were waiting for his final decision on the restaurant chain proposal. their carefully crafted financial models and risk assessments suddenly seeming irrelevant in light of what he had just witnessed. The numbers on their spreadsheets couldn't capture the cultural toxicity that Paul had displayed, couldn't quantify the damage that such attitudes would cause in markets where respect and cultural sensitivity weren't just nice-to-have qualities, but absolute requirements for business success. His fingers hovered over the phone's screen as he considered how to communicate his findings to a team that had spent months preparing for what they had assumed would be a routine approval process. Their excitement about the deal's potential now destined to be crushed by the reality of what this company actually represented at its operational core. The $3 billion that had seemed like a natural investment just hours earlier now felt like money that would be better deployed elsewhere, in companies that understood the true requirements of global success. As Paul approached his table with the kind of obsequious attention that managers typically reserved for customers they perceived as important, Mr. Kenji prepared himself for a conversation that would reveal whether the cultural blindness he had witnessed was an isolated incident or a systemic problem that permeated the entire organization. The manager's smile carried the practiced insincerity of someone who had learned to perform customer service without understanding its deeper meaning, his approach telegraphing the kind of superficial attention that prioritized appearance over substance. Mr. Kenji's response to Paul's inevitable questions about his dining experience would be carefully calibrated to extract maximum information about the manager's worldview and decision-making processes. His decades of experience in corporate evaluation having taught him exactly which questions would reveal the most about someone's character and competence. The conversation that was about to unfold would determine not just the fate of the $3 billion investment, but potentially the future of everyone connected to this restaurant chain, from the executives in their corporate boardrooms to the servers who depended on their jobs for survival. Subscribe to witness the moment when Paul discovers that his victim was actually the most powerful person in the room. The silence that followed Mr. Kenji's revelation stretched like a taut wire ready to snap, each second amplifying the magnitude of Paul's catastrophic mistake. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath as the weight of $3 billion hung in the air like an executioner's blade, poised to fall upon the man who had just destroyed everything with his arrogance. Hannah stood frozen between disbelief and vindication, watching as the color drained from Paul's face like water from a broken dam, his confident smirk dissolving into something resembling pure terror. The other customers had stopped eating entirely, their forks suspended mid-air, as they witnessed what would become the most expensive firing in corporate history, a moment that would ripple through the business world like an earthquake. Mr. Kenji's calm demeanor remained unchanged, but there was something in his eyes now, a cold calculation that spoke of boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions, the kind of look that could make or break entire companies with a single word. The fluorescent lights above seemed to buzz louder now, casting harsh shadows across Paul's face as he struggled to comprehend the magnitude of his error, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air in a world that had suddenly become hostile. Paul's hands began to tremble as the full implications crashed over him like a tsunami of realization. He hadn't just fired a waitress. He had potentially destroyed a $3 billion partnership with his xenophobic outburst. The restaurant's atmosphere had shifted from casual dining to something resembling a courtroom, where Paul stood as the unwitting defendant in a trial he never saw coming. His eyes darted frantically between Hannah and Mr. Kenji, searching for some sign that this was all an elaborate joke, that the quiet Japanese man couldn't possibly be the investor who held the company's future in his hands. But the truth was written in Mr. Kenji's steady gaze and Hannah's growing understanding of what had just transpired, a truth that made Paul's legs feel weak beneath him. The other staff members had begun to gather at the edges of the dining room. drawn by the tension that crackled through the air like electricity before a storm, their whispered conversations creating a low hum of anticipation. Mr. Kenji reached into his jacket pocket with deliberate slowness, withdrawing a business card that seemed to glow with significance in the harsh restaurant lighting, each letter of his name and title carrying the weight of corporate empires. Paul's breathing became shallow as he watched the card being placed on the table with the precision of a chess master making a final, decisive move. The simple piece of cardstock represented everything Paul had just thrown away: respect, opportunity, and a future that had been within the company's grasp until his prejudice had torn it apart like tissue paper in a hurricane. Hannah felt a strange mixture of emotions coursing through her as she watched her former tormentor begin to understand the gravity of his actions, her initial satisfaction giving way to something more complex. The injustice she had suffered was being balanced on cosmic scales, but she couldn't help feeling a twinge of sympathy for the man who was about to lose everything because of his own ignorance. Mr. Kenji's presence seemed to fill the room now, his quiet authority more powerful than any shouting or threats could have been, commanding respect through sheer force of character and accomplishment. The business card lay on the table like evidence in a trial, its elegant script spelling out not just a name and title, but the destruction of Paul's career and possibly the entire restaurant's future. Other customers began to pull out their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would become a story told and retold in business schools and corporate boardrooms for years to come. The irony was almost too perfect. A man fired for showing cultural sensitivity and language skills to the very person who could have valued those qualities most. Paul's world was crumbling around him with each passing second, the foundation of his authority and confidence eroding like sandcastles before an incoming tide of consequence and regret. The weight of Mr. Kenji's identity settled over the restaurant like a heavy blanket, suffocating Paul's remaining composure and leaving him gasping for air in a room that suddenly felt too small. His mind raced through the implications, not just for himself, but for everyone who worked there, everyone whose livelihoods depended on the success of a business that he had just potentially destroyed with his bigotry. Hannah watched as sweat began to bead on Paul's forehead, despite the air conditioning, his shirt collar seeming to tighten around his neck like a noose of his own making. The other employees exchanged worried glances, beginning to understand that they were witnessing more than just a workplace dispute. They were seeing the moment when prejudice met consequence in the most devastating way possible. Mr. Kenji remained seated, his calm presence a stark contrast to the chaos he had unleashed simply by revealing his true identity, like a stone thrown into still water creating ripples that would reach every shore. The restaurant's cheerful decor now seemed almost mocking, its bright colors and welcoming atmosphere at odds with the corporate drama unfolding within its walls. Paul's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as he struggled to find words that could somehow undo what had been done, but the silence stretched on, filled only with the sound of his own rapid breathing and the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen where life continued. Oblivious to the earthquake happening in the dining room, the magnitude of Paul's error began to crystallize in the minds of everyone present, each person understanding in their own way that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered long after the last customer had left. Hannah felt a strange sense of destiny, as if all the years of studying Japanese, all the cultural appreciation she had cultivated, had led to this singular moment of vindication. Mr. Kenji's business card seemed to pulse with significance on the table, a small rectangle of paper that represented the difference between corporate success and catastrophic failure. The other customers had stopped pretending to eat, their meals forgotten as they watched the drama unfold with the fascination of spectators at a gladiatorial contest. Paul's breathing had become audible now, each inhale and exhale marking another second of his professional life slipping away like sand through an hourglass. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with mechanical indifference, illuminating a scene that would be dissected and analyzed in business journals and case studies for decades to come. The irony was almost poetic. A man who had fired someone for embracing cultural diversity now faced the consequences of his actions from the very culture he had dismissed, a perfect circle of justice that seemed orchestrated by fate itself. Mr. Kenji finally broke the silence, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives and billions of dollars. "I came here today to finalize our partnership," he said, each word falling like a hammer blow on Paul's crumbling composure. "But I find myself questioning whether this establishment truly shares our company's values of respect and cultural appreciation." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, their implications clear to everyone present. The $3 billion deal that had been within reach was now slipping away like smoke in the wind. Hannah felt her heart racing as she realized that her simple act of speaking Japanese had become the catalyst for something far greater than she had ever imagined, a butterfly effect that would reshape the entire trajectory of the business. Paul's face had gone from pale to ashen, his eyes wide with the kind of terror that comes from watching one's entire world collapse in real time, brick by brick, decision by decision. The other staff members stood frozen like statues, afraid to move or speak, lest they somehow make the situation worse, their jobs hanging in the balance of a conversation they never could have anticipated. The restaurant had become a theater, and they were all unwilling actors in a drama that would end with either redemption or ruin, with no middle ground in sight. Subscribe to discover whether Paul can find any way to salvage the deal that his prejudice has shattered, or if his moment of bigotry will cost everyone their future. Paul's legs nearly gave out beneath him as the full weight of Mr. Kenji's words settled into his consciousness, like poison seeping through his veins, each syllable a nail in the coffin of his career and the restaurant's future. The $3 billion partnership that had been the cornerstone of the company's expansion plans was evaporating before his eyes, dissolving like sugar in rain because of his own toxic prejudice and cultural ignorance. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly as he struggled to form words that could somehow bridge the chasm he had created. But every potential apology felt inadequate against the magnitude of his transgression. The other customers watched with morbid fascination as a man's professional life disintegrated in real time, their phones now openly recording what would undoubtedly become a viral sensation within hours. Hannah stood transfixed by the cosmic justice unfolding before her, watching as the man who had humiliated her for showing kindness and cultural respect now faced the consequences of his actions from the very person he had unknowingly insulted. The business card on the table seemed to glow with an otherworldly significance, a small piece of paper that represented the difference between prosperity and catastrophe for everyone in the building. Mr. Kenji's calm demeanor remained unshaken, but there was something in his posture now, a subtle shift that suggested he was already mentally withdrawing from any potential business relationship, his mind calculating the reputational risks of associating with an establishment that tolerated such behavior. The silence stretched like a rubber band, ready to snap, filled with the weight of unspoken consequences and the sound of Paul's increasingly labored breathing as panic began to set in. His shirt was now visibly damp with perspiration, dark stains spreading across the fabric like ink blots of shame and terror, each drop of sweat a testament to the heat of his crumbling world. The other employees had begun to whisper among themselves, their voices creating a low buzz of anxiety as they realized their own jobs hung in the balance of this catastrophic encounter. Hannah felt a strange mixture of vindication and sympathy watching Paul's descent into desperation, her anger at his treatment beginning to give way to something more complex as she witnessed the human cost of prejudice. The restaurant's cheerful atmosphere had been completely transformed, its bright colors and welcoming decor now seeming almost surreal against the backdrop of corporate drama and personal destruction. Mr. Kenji's presence dominated the room despite his quiet demeanor, his very stillness more powerful than any dramatic gesture could have been, like the eye of a hurricane that promised devastation in its wake. The fluorescent lights continued their mechanical humming, indifferent to the human drama playing out beneath them, illuminating a scene that would be remembered and retold for years to come as a cautionary tale about the cost of bigotry. Finally, Paul found his voice, though it came out as little more than a strangled whisper that barely carried across the small distance between them. "Mr. Kenji, please," he began, his words tumbling over each other in a desperate rush to somehow undo the irreversible. "I had no idea who you were. I never meant to." But even as he spoke, he could see the futility of his words reflected in the investor's unchanging expression. The damage had been done not just to Mr. Kenji, but to Hannah, and the pattern of disrespect was now laid bare for everyone to see, a toxic culture that no amount of apologizing could immediately erase. His hands shook as he gestured helplessly, trying to convey remorse that felt hollow even to himself, knowing that his regret was born not from genuine understanding, but from the terror of consequence. The other customers continued to watch with the fascination of spectators at a train wreck, their meals forgotten as they witnessed what would undoubtedly become one of the most expensive mistakes in corporate history. Hannah remained silent, her presence a living reminder of Paul's prejudice and the injustice that had set this entire catastrophe in motion, her very existence in the room serving as evidence of his character. Mr. Kenji's business card lay on the table like a piece of evidence in a trial, its elegant script spelling out not just a name and title, but the destruction of dreams and the collapse of carefully laid plans. The desperation in Paul's voice grew more pronounced with each word as he continued his futile attempt at damage control, his professional composure completely shattered like glass against stone. "The company values diversity. We celebrate different cultures," he stammered, the irony of his words hanging heavy in the air like smoke from a fire he had started himself. But Mr. Kenji's expression remained unchanged, his dark eyes reflecting a wisdom born from decades of business dealings and an understanding of human nature that saw through hollow corporate speak to the truth beneath. The other staff members watched their manager's humiliation with a mixture of horror and fascination, realizing that they were witnessing the moment when prejudice met its match in the form of consequence and accountability. Hannah felt the weight of history in the room, understanding that this moment would ripple outward far beyond the walls of the restaurant, becoming a story that would be told and retold as an example of how quickly bigotry could destroy everything. The air conditioning hummed with mechanical indifference, circulating the tension and fear that had settled over the dining room like a toxic cloud. Paul's career was dissolving before his eyes like salt in water, each second that passed without forgiveness, from Mr. Kenji marking another step toward professional oblivion and personal ruin. The magnitude of the situation began to dawn on the other employees as they realized that their own futures were tied to Paul's catastrophic error in judgment, their jobs hanging in the balance of a conversation that had spiraled far beyond anyone's control. The restaurant had become a pressure cooker of tension and anxiety, with every person present understanding that they were witnessing something that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Mr. Kenji's silence was more devastating than any angry outburst could have been, his calm demeanor suggesting a man who had already made his decision and was simply allowing events to unfold according to their natural course. Paul's attempts at explanation grew more frantic and less coherent as he grasped for any words that might somehow bridge the unbridgeable chasm he had created with his prejudice and ignorance. The business card on the table seemed to pulse with significance, a small rectangle of paper that represented billions of dollars and thousands of jobs, all hanging in the balance of this moment. Hannah watched the scene unfold with a sense of surreal detachment, as if she were observing her own vindication from outside her body, seeing justice served in a way she never could have imagined. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Paul's face, highlighting every line of stress and terror as he realized that his moment of bigotry had cost him everything he had worked to build. Mr. Kenji finally moved, reaching for his business card with the deliberate slowness of a man who had made a final decision, his fingers closing around the small piece of paper that represented so much more than contact information. "I think," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions, "that this conversation has revealed everything I need to know about the culture of this establishment." The words fell like a death sentence on Paul's ears, each syllable marking another nail in the coffin of his career and the restaurant's future. The finality of the statement leaving no room for negotiation or redemption. The other customers held their breath as they witnessed the moment when $3 billion walked away from a business because of one man's prejudice, a cautionary tale that would be told in business schools for generations to come. Paul's face crumpled as the reality of his situation hit him with the force of a physical blow, his body swaying as if he might collapse under the weight of his own actions and their consequences. The restaurant's bright decor now seemed almost mocking, its cheerful colors a stark contrast to the darkness that had settled over everyone's future like a storm cloud. Hannah felt a complex mixture of emotions as she watched justice being served, her vindication tempered by the knowledge that innocent people would suffer for Paul's mistakes. Subscribe to witness the moment when Mr. Kenji makes his final decision about the partnership and discover whether Hannah's courage to speak up might somehow change the course of this corporate catastrophe. The moment stretched like eternity as Mr. Kenji held his business card, the small piece of paper trembling slightly in his fingers as if it carried the weight of every decision that had led to this catastrophic confrontation. Paul's world had narrowed to a single point of focus, the investor's face, searching desperately for any sign of mercy or reconsideration, but finding only the cold calculation of a man who had built empires by making difficult decisions without sentiment. The restaurant had become a tomb of silence, every person present holding their breath as they witnessed what would undoubtedly become one of the most expensive moments of prejudice in corporate history. Hannah felt the weight of destiny pressing down upon her shoulders, understanding that her next words might determine not just her own future, but the fate of everyone who worked in this building. Their livelihoods hanging in the balance of a conversation that had spiraled far beyond anyone's control. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with mechanical indifference, casting harsh shadows across the faces of people whose lives were about to be forever changed by the consequences of one man's bigotry. Kenji's calm demeanor remained unchanged, but there was something in his eyes now, a sadness that spoke of disappointment in humanity's capacity for prejudice, a weariness born from encountering the same ignorance in boardrooms and businesses around the world. The other customers continued to watch with morbid fascination, their phones capturing every moment of what would soon become a viral sensation, a cautionary tale about the cost of cultural insensitivity in an interconnected world. Hannah stepped forward, her movement cutting through the tension like a knife through silk, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment as she addressed Mr. Kenji directly. "Kenji-san," she began, using the respectful honorific that Paul had mocked just minutes earlier, "I want you to know that not everyone here shares his views." Her words carried the weight of genuine conviction, spoken in perfect Japanese that flowed like music in the sterile air of the restaurant, each syllable a bridge across the cultural divide that Paul had tried to widen with his ignorance. The sound of her voice, speaking his native language, seemed to surprise Mr. Kenji, his eyebrows raising slightly as he turned his full attention to the young woman who had been so callously dismissed by her manager. Paul watched in growing horror as Hannah continued to speak, realizing that she was not just conversing in Japanese, but doing so with a fluency and cultural understanding that made his earlier dismissal of her abilities seem even more ignorant and destructive. The other employees stared in amazement as their former colleague demonstrated skills that none of them had known she possessed, her linguistic abilities revealing depths of character and dedication that Paul had been too blind to see. Mr. Kenji's expression began to soften as he listened to Hannah's words, her respectful tone and proper usage of honorifics demonstrating exactly the kind of cultural sensitivity that his company valued in their international partnerships. The business card remained in his hand, but his grip had loosened slightly, as if Hannah's intervention had introduced a new variable into his calculations. The conversation between Hannah and Mr. Kenji flowed like a river, finding its natural course, their words creating a bubble of understanding in the midst of the chaos that Paul had created with his prejudice and ignorance. She spoke of her love for Japanese culture, her years of study, and her deep respect for the values of harmony and mutual respect that form the foundation of meaningful business relationships. Mr. Kenji responded with growing interest, his questions revealing a man who appreciated not just linguistic ability, but genuine cultural understanding, the kind of deep respect that could bridge any gap between different worlds. Paul stood frozen like a statue, watching his former employee demonstrate exactly the qualities that could have made the partnership successful, her every word highlighting his own failure to recognize value when it stood directly in front of him. The other customers had stopped pretending to eat entirely, their meals forgotten, as they witnessed what felt like a diplomatic negotiation happening in real time, with billions of dollars hanging in the balance of every carefully chosen word. The restaurant's atmosphere had shifted from corporate catastrophe to something resembling hope, as if Hannah's intervention had opened a door that Paul's prejudice had slammed shut. The fluorescent lights seemed less harsh now, their mechanical humming providing a steady backdrop to a conversation that was reshaping the entire trajectory of the situation with each passing moment. Mr. Kenji's demeanor continued to evolve as he spoke with Hannah, his initial coldness giving way to something approaching warmth as he recognized in her the kind of cultural bridge builder that his company sought in their international ventures. Her knowledge went beyond mere language skills, encompassing an understanding of business etiquette, cultural nuances, and the subtle art of relationship building that formed the backbone of successful Japanese business practices. Paul felt his stomach drop as he realized that he had not just fired a waitress, he had dismissed exactly the kind of employee who could have been instrumental in making the partnership successful. His prejudice blinding him to value that was now being revealed for everyone to see. The other staff members exchanged glances of amazement and growing hope, beginning to understand that Hannah's intervention might somehow salvage a situation that had seemed beyond redemption just moments before. The business card in Mr. Kenji's hand had stopped trembling, his grip relaxing as the conversation continued to flow in directions that Paul's narrow worldview had never allowed him to imagine. Hannah's voice carried a confidence born from genuine knowledge and respect, each word carefully chosen to demonstrate not just linguistic ability, but cultural understanding that transcended mere translation. The irony was almost too perfect. The woman Paul had fired for wasting time speaking Japanese was now the only person in the room capable of potentially saving the deal that his bigotry had destroyed. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was palpable as Hannah and Mr. Kenji continued their conversation, their mutual respect creating a foundation for understanding that Paul's prejudice had tried to demolish with ignorance and fear. She spoke of her dreams of working in international business, her dedication to building bridges between cultures, and her belief that diversity was not just a corporate buzzword, but a genuine source of strength and innovation. Mr. Kenji nodded approvingly as she demonstrated knowledge of Japanese business customs that went far beyond what any casual student might possess, her understanding revealing years of dedicated study and genuine appreciation for his culture. Paul watched in growing desperation as the conversation continued, realizing that every word Hannah spoke was highlighting his own failure as a manager and as a human being, his prejudice exposed for the toxic force it truly was. The other employees began to smile for the first time since the confrontation had begun, sensing that Hannah's intervention might somehow transform catastrophe into opportunity, disaster into redemption. The restaurant's bright decor no longer seemed mocking, but hopeful, its cheerful colors reflecting the possibility that understanding might triumph over ignorance, that respect might overcome prejudice. Mr. Kenji's business card remained in his hand, but it no longer seemed like a weapon of corporate destruction. Instead, it had become a symbol of potential partnership, a bridge between worlds that Hannah was helping to construct with every carefully chosen word. The conversation reached a natural pause as Mr. Kenji considered everything he had heard, his dark eyes moving between Hannah's hopeful face and Paul's expression of dawning terror as he realized that his former employee might actually succeed in salvaging what his prejudice had destroyed. The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension. This was the quiet of possibility, of decisions being weighed and futures being calculated by a man who understood the true value of cultural understanding in an interconnected world. Hannah stood with quiet dignity, her intervention complete, having done everything she could to demonstrate that not everyone in the establishment shared Paul's narrow worldview and toxic prejudices. The other customers continued to watch with fascination, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. A moment when justice and redemption intersected in ways that seemed almost too perfect to be real. Paul's breathing had become shallow as he realized that his fate now rested in the hands of the woman he had so callously dismissed, the cosmic irony of the situation not lost on anyone present in the room. The fluorescent lights hummed with mechanical indifference, illuminating a scene that would be remembered and analyzed for years to come as an example of how quickly prejudice could be overcome by genuine understanding and respect. Subscribe to discover Mr. Kenji's final decision about the partnership and learn whether Hannah's courage and cultural understanding can transform this corporate catastrophe into an opportunity for justice and redemption. Mr. Kenji set his business card down on the table with deliberate precision, the small rectangle of paper no longer a weapon of corporate destruction, but a symbol of possibility, as he considered the extraordinary turn of events that Hannah's intervention had created. The restaurant held its collective breath as the investors' eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in the faces of employees whose futures hung in the balance, customers who had become unwitting witnesses to corporate drama, and Paul, whose career teetered on the precipice of complete annihilation. Hannah stood with quiet dignity beside the table, her intervention complete, having demonstrated not just linguistic ability, but the kind of cultural understanding and respect that formed the foundation of successful international business relationships. The silence stretched like a taut wire as everyone waited for Mr. Kenji's verdict, understanding that his next words would determine whether this moment became a cautionary tale of prejudice triumphant or a story of redemption and justice served. Paul's face had gone beyond pale to a sickly grey colour, his shirt now completely soaked with perspiration as he realized that his fate rested entirely in the hands of the man he had unknowingly insulted and the woman he had so callously dismissed. The fluorescent lights continued their mechanical humming, casting harsh shadows across a scene that would be dissected and analyzed in business schools and corporate boardrooms for decades to come. The other employees watched with a mixture of hope and terror, their own jobs hanging in the balance of a decision that would ripple outward far beyond the walls of this single restaurant. Mr. Kenji's voice, when it finally came, carried the weight of boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions, each word carefully measured and precisely delivered with the authority of a man accustomed to shaping the destinies of companies and careers. "In my 40 years of business," he began, his accent lending gravity to words that would determine the fate of everyone present, "I have learned that the true character of an organization is revealed not in its policies or mission statements, but in how it treats its people when no one important is watching." The words fell like hammer blows on Paul's consciousness, each syllable a nail in the coffin of his managerial career, as the investor's meaning became crystal clear to everyone in the room. Hannah felt her heart racing as she realized that Mr. Kenji was not just addressing the immediate situation, but speaking to larger principles of justice and human dignity that transcended any single business deal. The other customers leaned forward in their seats, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. A moment when corporate power was being wielded not for profit, but for principle, justice served by someone with the authority to make it meaningful. Paul's legs began to tremble as the implications of Mr. Kenji's words sank in, his mind racing through the catastrophic consequences that were about to unfold, like dominoes falling in perfect sequence. The restaurant's cheerful decor seemed to pulse with significance now, its bright colors reflecting the hope that justice might actually triumph over prejudice in a world that often seemed to reward the opposite. The investor's gaze moved deliberately to Paul, his dark eyes reflecting a coldness that spoke of decisions made in boardrooms where billions of dollars hung in the balance of character assessments and trust evaluations. "What I witnessed here today, Mr. Kenji continued, his voice never rising but somehow filling the entire space with its authority, was not just poor customer service, but a fundamental failure of leadership and human decency that makes any business partnership impossible." The words hit Paul like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of his professional identity, until he stood exposed as nothing more than a small-minded bigot whose prejudice had cost him everything. Hannah watched the scene unfold with a mixture of vindication and sympathy, seeing justice served, but also witnessing the human cost of ignorance and hate in real time. The other employees exchanged glances of relief and amazement, beginning to understand that they were witnessing not just the downfall of a toxic manager, but the triumph of principles that many had thought were merely corporate buzzwords. Mr. Kenji's business card lay on the table like evidence in a trial, its presence a reminder that this moment would have consequences far beyond the immediate humiliation of one prejudiced manager. The fluorescent lights cast stark shadows across Paul's face, highlighting every line of terror and regret as he realized that his moment of bigotry had destroyed not just his own future, but potentially the livelihoods of everyone who worked under him. But then Mr. Kenji's attention shifted to Hannah, his expression softening as he addressed the woman whose courage and cultural understanding had transformed a moment of corporate catastrophe into something approaching redemption. "However," he said, the single word carrying the weight of possibility and hope, "I have also witnessed something else today, the kind of cultural bridge building and genuine respect that forms the foundation of successful international partnerships." Hannah felt her breath catch in her throat as she realized that the investor was not just acknowledging her intervention, but recognizing something deeper in her character and abilities. The other employees leaned forward with growing excitement, sensing that the conversation was taking a turn that none of them had dared to hope for just minutes earlier. Paul watched in growing horror as he realized that his former employee was not just being praised, but potentially being positioned as his replacement in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. The restaurant's atmosphere had shifted completely now, the tension of impending doom giving way to something that felt almost like celebration as justice began to take shape in unexpected ways. Mr. Kenji's voice carried a warmth now that had been completely absent when he addressed Paul, his tone suggesting possibilities that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. The business card on the table seemed to glow with new significance, no longer a symbol of lost opportunity, but a bridge to futures that prejudice had tried to destroy, but understanding had somehow salvaged. The investor reached into his jacket and withdrew a second business card, this one blank on the back, and began writing something with a gold pen that caught the fluorescent light like a beacon of hope in the sterile restaurant air. "Miss Hannah," he said, his pronunciation of her name careful and respectful, "your demonstration of cultural understanding and linguistic ability today has shown me exactly the kind of person my company seeks for our international ventures." L'did-you-too, the words hung in the air like music, their implications slowly dawning on everyone present as they realized that this moment was transforming from corporate catastrophe to career opportunity in ways that seemed almost too perfect to be real. Paul's face went from grey to green as he understood that he was not just losing his job, but watching his former employee potentially gain something far better than anything he could have offered her. The other staff members began to smile openly now, their relief and excitement palpable as they witnessed what felt like cosmic justice being served with precision and grace. Hannah felt tears of joy and disbelief beginning to form in her eyes as she realized that her simple act of kindness and cultural respect was being rewarded in ways she never could have imagined. The restaurant had become a theater of transformation, where prejudice was being defeated not by anger or revenge, but by the simple power of human decency and mutual respect. Mr. Kenji finished writing on the business card and extended it toward Hannah with both hands, the gesture carrying the weight of Japanese business etiquette and respect that Paul had been too ignorant to recognize or appreciate. The moment when Hannah accepted the business card felt like the culmination of every story about justice triumphing over prejudice, her fingers trembling slightly as she realized that this small piece of paper represented not just a job opportunity, but validation of everything she had worked to achieve through years of cultural study and dedication. Mr. Kenji's smile was genuine now, the warmth in his eyes reflecting recognition of kindred spirit, someone who understood that business was ultimately about building bridges between people and cultures rather than walls of ignorance and fear. Paul stood frozen in a tableau of his own making, watching his former employee receive opportunities that his prejudice had made impossible for anyone in his establishment to achieve. The irony, so perfect it seemed orchestrated by forces beyond human understanding. The other customers had stopped pretending to eat entirely, their phones openly recording what would undoubtedly become one of the most shared videos in corporate social media history, a story of justice served and prejudice punished that would inspire millions around the world. The restaurant's bright decor now seemed to celebrate the moment, its cheerful colors reflecting the joy and hope that had replaced the earlier tension and fear like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The fluorescent lights hummed with what now seemed like approval, illuminating a scene that would be remembered and retold as proof that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe conspires to ensure that justice is served and good people are rewarded for their courage and character. Subscribe to witness the final moments of this incredible transformation as Mr. Kenji delivers his ultimate verdict on the partnership and Paul faces the full consequences of his prejudice and ignorance. The deal is withdrawn under current management. Kenji said, finishing it cleanly. Paul's posture collapsed. Yet if this location installs leadership that embodies cultural respect, we will reconsider. Eyes shifted to Hannah. The path was visible. New management, new culture, renewed deal. Hannah accepted the card, future in her palm. Justice didn't gloat, it reoriented. Staff gathered around her like a new center of gravity. The story closed its circle. Prejudice cost billions. Integrity reopened the door.